So the first on our program, we'd like to welcome Claude Jacob, who took the helm as the Director of San Antonio Metropolitan Health District on July 6th and oversees the Community Health and Safety, Communicable Disease, and Environmental Health and Operations divisions, in addition to COVID-19 community and response efforts. Prior to joining MetroHealth, Claude was Chief Public Health Officer for the Cambridge Public Health Department in Massachusetts for 14 years, and is a past president of the National Association of County and City Health Officials. A believer in lifelong learning, Claude is currently a doctoral candidate in health leadership at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Gilding School of Public Health. Since arriving here, Claude said he has discovered San Antonio to be a warm and friendly city with great cultural diversity and beautiful surroundings. I don't know if he means warm as in hot or warm as in welcoming. Either way, they're both true. So please welcome Claude to the program.
All right. Thank you, Amanda. Very happy to be here. Bidding you greetings on behalf of our City Manager, Eric Walsh. Bidding you greetings from our nationally accredited health department at Metro Health. So we are a district level agency where our public health reach spans across the city of San Antonio and Bexar County. So I'm excited to be here tonight. But to answer Amanda's question about warm, yes, warm in culture, warm in feel, and warmer than Massachusetts, let me tell you. So I'd like to thank the members of the AAHD Planning Committee and the Well Women Well Community Action Board for the wonderful invitation to join you this evening for this symposium. As you've heard, I'm fairly new to San Antonio, but not new to public health. But I joined a fantastic team at Metro Health in early July, and I'm enjoying the experience of learning about all the great work going on in this community. So, again, I've had a journey over the course of the last 25 years. Before moving to Cambridge, for the last 14 years, I lived in Chicago, which I consider to be my hometown. I went to high school there, went to graduate school there, met my wife there, and I've lived in Brooklyn, New York, as well as Baltimore, Maryland, so I'm accustomed to living in large urban environments. I've visited San Antonio several times for conferences, so I've checked out the Riverwalk, and I realized there's more to San Antonio than the Riverwalk. So my wife actually went to grad school here, so she's an alum of Our Lady of the Lake. She studied social work, and so she'd always talked about this magical kingdom down here. So you've already heard what I really like about the city of San Antonio. Again, I'm settling in, still making friends on the playground, and really, I can't thank you enough for this invitation, this wonderful invitation, just to chat a little bit about the work at Metro Health. Just additional context, so I was born in Toledo, Ohio, and my siblings were all born in New York City. My folks are islanders, so they hail from Haiti. They came here in the 60s. We actually spent a few years down there, so I do speak French and Haitian Creole, and so this is a part of the experience, part of my journey, and part of my lens as I think about my work. You might wonder why I chose a career in public health, and I was greatly influenced by my parents, who are retired clinicians. And much to their chagrin, I opted for a non-clinical career for a whole lot of personal reasons. But I got to tell you, no regrets. Really excited about just my journey over time, and this is an opportunity to serve here in this fair city. So, when the opportunity came across my desk to at least join you tonight, I really was excited because of the timeliness of this. It's been a long year and a half tied to this COVID experience. We have a fantastic panel, fantastic forum, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Dr. Salas as well as Dr. Wu's presentations tonight. So just know that each and every one of you are deputized as ambassadors of our work, and I can't say thanks enough. And I see Norma, who oversees the WIC program and the Healthy Start Initiative, and the GAG staff who are here tonight, so this is exciting for me. With that, for additional context to set the tone for our forum this evening, I started out my public career, believe it or not, as a grad student who conducted surveys for a Healthy Start program on the west side of Chicago. While that project was over 25 years ago, the stories and conversations made a lasting impression. I spent the early part of my career on the west and south sides of Chicago running violence prevention programs, collaborations with area nonprofits and faith-based organizations, as well as wellness programs for area seniors. And I consider myself to be a senior in training. So you fast forward to the last 20 years where I've had the honor of working for state or local health departments in Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, and now Texas. So you'll hear tonight about the data about infant death, and it paints a clear picture of a critical connection between the work of the Healthy Start program and the role of the African American Health Disparities Council. Healthy Start serves families in the 12 zip codes across the city and county that are most disparately affected by infant death, experiencing rates more than 1.5 times the national average. The rates of infant death in these 12 zip codes and the rest of the county are driven by those occurring in our communities of color. October is recognized as Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month, so let me share some data for additional context. Black residents are the most impacted by infant death. For the period between 2012 and 2016, non-Hispanic blacks had an infant mortality rate of 11.8 compared to a rate of 6 for their white counterparts. Compared to earlier data from 2010 to 2014, the disparity gap is widening, with the infant mortality rate for non-Hispanic blacks increasing by 18%. For comparison, Hispanics experienced a more modest increase of 4%, and whites experienced a slight decrease. Again, the gap is very clear. So, Healthy Start focuses on these disparities by reaching out to those who are at highest risk of experiencing them. They do this in many ways by providing case management, education, and outreach, hosting the Fetal Infant Mortality Review Team, and serving as the backbone for the Healthy Families Network Coalition. One of the community action boards of the Healthy Families Network is, again, the African American Health Disparities Council, which brings me to our reason for gathering tonight. AAHD initiated its work in 2017, many of you know this, with an initial focus on examining the disparities in maternal and infant death experienced by San Antonio's Black families, and has moved on over the years to focus on other health issues and conditions of importance. Recently, the most keenly felt issue related to the impact of the COVID experience in our communities and how it affects Black residents. Using community surveys, Healthy Start and AAHD became aware that there was an information gap for many residents. Again, in public health, we are organizing in 10 essential services. The classic framework talks about essential service number 3, which is that we are called to inform, educate, and empower communities about health issues. So this forum serves in that vein. So I just want to take a last moment to at least highlight what's happening at Metro Health. We offer free health programs and services that require equal attention. A lot of this has been sort of muted because of the COVID experience, but just know that we have programs for asthma, diabetes prevention, maternal services, infant and children, nutrition, and family violence prevention, just to name a few. All part of our mission to prevent illness, promote healthier lifestyles, and protect the community against hazards and disease. My goals coming in as your new Metro Health bus driver, it's really on focusing on prioritizing areas around our strategic growth plan. So we have a 5-year blueprint looking at mental health, violence prevention, access to care, and our efforts around addressing health justice. So just know that this is part of my life's work, just thinking about the experience I've had in many communities, and I'm honored and pleased to come here to San Antonio. Just know that today we wrapped up the 149th gathering of the American Public Health Association, and the overarching theme for that national conference is really about being the healthiest nation in a generation. So next year we will celebrate our 150th anniversary as a profession, and I heard, at any rate, heard comments by Dr. David Satcher, who was really talking about the importance of still staying on this work towards eliminating health disparities. So I truly believe that San Antonio can be one of the healthiest cities over time. In Metro Health, we are committed to demonstrating what public health can do to improve the lives of our community. So we continue to work with our residents and our partners to uphold our vision of being a healthy community, healthy people, thriving in a healthy community. So tonight, the Real Talk with Real Providers series provides a way for providers of color to reach out to community members to answer questions they may have about COVID-19 and receive information from healthcare professionals whom they can trust. We established a similar structure in Cambridge, so I'm familiar with this model, and I found this approach to be very effective and popular with area providers and residents alike. So to tell you more about the African American Health Disparities Council and the Real Talk series. Please allow me to introduce the Honorable Zeta Powell. Zeta is a workforce development analyst with our performance improvement team at Metro Health. She's also the chairperson of AAHD in her spare time, of course. So I'm new to Texas, and there's this tagline, "Don't mess with Texas." I would add, "Don't mess with Zeta." So please welcome Zeta Powell. Come on down.
Good evening, everyone. Wow. That's tall shoes there for me to fill. So yes, I am Zeta Powell, and I am just a static member of the African American Health Disparities Council. It's a council that I was so pleased to be able to join because it took my inner passion and put action to it. And so I am a mover. Standing next to a podium, I cannot commit that I will stand here the entire time. So with that, I'm going to take the mic. So, the African American Health Disparities Council.
Other way.
Thank you.
There you go.
So again, and I thank you so much, Mr. Jacob. You have done a fantastic job of really going over everything. So with that, I will just give you kind of like a high-level summary of the details you've already received, because I'm not sure if you're as excited as I am, but I'm looking forward to our guest speaker and definitely our panelists. So permit me to kind of whiz through my presentation here. So yes, the African American Health Disparities Council started in August of 2017, starting first with the focus with maternal and child health, and then moving forward to expand to just cover all health disparities that we were aware of here in San Antonio, Texas. And then you'll see some of the logos of the agencies who have partnered with us to ensure that we're able to get this information out, and not only that, but provide resources and action for what we're bringing awareness to here in our community. With our mission to create community-driven programs that reduce disparities in health outcomes for African American residents here in San Antonio. And again, not to just kind of read that verbatim for you, but really creating that safe space to bring residents together with those who can help put action to concerns so that we can be one of the healthiest cities in the United States. And we are well on our way of doing so. With what we were able to do was start out first with awareness, putting together community chats. So starting in October of 2017 with our initial focus, which was infant mortality, and then moving towards our maternal mortality, excuse me, I'm trying to go too fast. And then really bringing forth discussions regarding violence. So with the African American Health Disparities Council, what we were doing was going out and actually going out into the community with surveys and talking to individuals, not just trying to sit in a room and decide what's going on, but getting out to where the people are. We have great members of Metro Health who volunteered their time, as well as the other agencies would bring forth volunteers for us to go out and canvass our neighborhoods and ask, point blank, knock on doors, stop people when they're taking their kids out to soccer at the YMCA, and really wanting to know what is on your heart, what are your concerns, and then tailor-making our community chats so that we can bring awareness to what is on the minds of the people right now. So that's why you'll see when we move towards discussions regarding violence in the area, access to care, and then the longest running series actually had to do with adverse childhood experiences and the trauma that our community is dealing with day after day after day. And sitting in one of the meetings and hearing the residents say, you know, yes, I've had to deal with, you know, infant mortality in our family, but we just decided that it's just life and that's something you have to deal with. Not knowing that there are individuals out there really seeking to make sure that this disparity is eradicated. Is there a lot of work to do? Yes, but someone's listening. But unfortunately, there has been a gap between those who are trying to provide resources and others who are actually needing the resources, thinking that no one cares, no one's listening. African American Health Disparities Council is that ear and that connection point. And so moving forward with our our community socials, hoops for hope. Because at times, unfortunately, we don't listen to our youth. We wait until it's too late. But Hoops for Hope was taking something that everyone enjoys and bringing individuals to say, you know, you have more options for your future. Yes, if you are athletically inclined, let's get you out to the NBA. But if by chance you have other interests, we had individuals there to show them the way to really guide and connect people with what they're wanting to do. Those silent dreams that sometimes are muffled because no one's listening. Well, we're listening. So our Hoops for Hope, very successful. And then, of course, COVID-19 changed the way we function in the world. So with our resource fairs, we had to start doing those virtually. So we held 2 virtual resource fairs, and the one I most enjoyed was our drive-through resource fair. Why get out? Let us come to you. So we had individuals just drive through, and of course we just had a lovely circle of our San Antonio area outreach groups, really going up to the cars and really giving information now, providing food, providing giveaways. And we actually saw some of our youth come through and really enjoy it. I had the opportunity to be at the very tail end to see the reaction of the residents before leaving, and everyone was weighed down with information they didn't know was out there with big smiles on their faces. So definitely our drive-through resource fair was a success and was an opportunity now that we were living with COVID and other issues, was our time for us to do another survey and really poll to find out what's on your mind today. We talked to you in 2017, it's a new world out there, what's going on with you? And the responses were great. So you'll get a little tease of that later on. So what is a health disparity? We see that health disparities adversely affect groups of people who have systematically experienced greater obstacles to health based on racial and ethnic groups, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, age, mental health, cognitive, sensory, or physical disabilities, sexual orientations, or gender identity, geographic location, and other characteristics. So we actually cover all of that. And our community chats, what we'll do is we'll have individuals who represent multiple groups to come out and really talk about how that particular topic affects them personally. And like I said earlier, our community chats and our meetings are a safe place. So we've had individuals share information with us that they hadn't shared with their families yet. But they really wanted everyone to understand exactly how all of this affects them and what they've had to experience because of it. And it really brings intimacy to what we're doing. The leading disparities here in San Antonio: infant mortality, maternal mortality, heart disease, diabetes, multiple types of cancers, domestic violence, gun violence, life expectancy, and HIV. That was one that was also really brought up. That was a topic that was very important and someone identified as something that we just don't talk about in our community. Well, we're talking about it now. Thank you, thank you. So, I am going to skip this, but actually ask everyone to look at your table. I like to hear you move around with me. The information from that link is actually listed for you to take home and to look over. I just wanted to make you aware of that. For our infant mortality, and again, thank you so much, Mr. Jacob, for doing a fantastic job of going over what the disparities look like in detail. So we were going to bring that out, but when you have a great leader, then there are some things you do not have to do. So thank you so very much for giving us those statistics and those details regarding infant mortality. And here is a chart charting out what the information that Mr. Jacob has already given to us. Speaking of HIV, of course, in the African American community of ours, we represent 13% of the U.S. population, but account for 44% of the infection cases, and that was in 2016. As far as African American men, 6 times more likely to die from HIV or AIDS, and look, for females, 18 times as likely to die from it. We're not talking about it, but it is in our community affecting us. What are we going to do? Let's bring awareness, education, protection, and then really go forth and make it normal for us to talk about the things that we're dealing with, not just with HIV, but with anything, so that we can make changes and lead towards a healthy future. Speaking of things that are affecting our community, look at high blood pressure rates. And this is in every age group. Diabetes, we talk about it, but we've talked about it for so long. Why are those numbers still the way that they are? And look, even strokes. These are things, we've talked about it so much, we hear it, we're like, yeah, we know it's happening, but why hasn't there been change? Let's come together and let's create an action plan for the community to make a difference. Yes? I just want to make sure I'm still in here. I don't hear anyone. Okay. I'll do it by myself, but I prefer to have you with me. Here's one that will really keep you up at night. Life expectancy. And it is the same here in San Antonio. I know we're getting this from our U.S. vital statistics, but San Antonio, you can even zero it down to zip codes and still have a difference like this with life expectancy. Here in San Antonio, a city full of love, full of excitement and celebrations, but not celebrating long enough. Look at our age ranges, 18 to 34, 35 to 49, but 50 to 64. We are losing the wisdom of our culture. And so yes, these other numbers, they won't move. Because those who, now that they know they have the experience, we're losing them too fast. But what are we going to do about it? What are we doing about it? It's not acceptable anymore. It's time to change. And here is that vehicle for you so that we can, because a lot of times you want to do something, you don't know where to go. You come to the African American Health Disparity Council meetings. You come to the community chats. And then you go out and you share what you've learned. That's the key. Because coming and gathering information and then walking away and not saying anything, not sharing that with your neighbor, your fellow man, it is no longer okay to do that. It is time for us to talk. The holidays are coming. Family gatherings are coming. After we have the pecan pie, which is so good, after the game, when we're enjoying that win or teasing those who voted for the wrong team, let's strike up a conversation. Go down, let's go Spurs. But let's strike up a conversation about what can we do to make sure that 20 years down the line, we're all still represented here in this room, alive and well, enjoying one another. Let's bring up these topics and make a difference. Some of the social factors that affect African Americans at an earlier age than others: unemployment, living in poverty, home ownership no longer being a dream. Please don't look at me when I say the next one: obesity, not being active. I am smoking, and not going to see a doctor. I won't tell you what the ones that I'm guilty of, quite a few. But I will say this, we can do something about it. There are individuals out there who will help with the unemployment rate. Earlier I spoke of Hoops for Hope. There were representatives there wanting to help kids know that you can start a summer job early. Here's how you do that. Living in poverty, we actually have resources for financial health and well-being. It's just we need to start talking about it. And I could go on and on and on, to be honest, because I'm very passionate about this. But I really want to encourage everyone to come out to the meetings. Come out to the community chats. If you know someone who needs the information, bring them with you. If you have information, bring it too. And that way we can all collaborate together, and then we can start going outside of four walls and really affecting change so that we can really see our community grow and thrive. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my passion and my enthusiasm. And now I really want to bring us back to what we were originally coming here to do, is talk about COVID-19. Those statistics for COVID-19 that are affecting the African American community and our San Antonio community as a whole. And to give details on this and really show us what is going on, we do have Dr. Jinda Wu. And thank you. I want to say this. I could read her bio. Will you please read? Exciting. I know, I'm so sorry. But I mean, she's heard this a million times, but I'll continue to do this. There are individuals in your life that you'll meet for 5 minutes, you'll enjoy one another, and you'll walk away. Maybe they leave some information in your life that may change you. But then there are those when you can see their work and their passion, and they work so quietly and so diligently, but everything that they do makes a difference. And those are the people that you really want to keep an eye out for. I want to add to your list Dr. Jinda Wu, our medical director. I just heard her take a deep breath. She really doesn't like all of this attention, but my passion tripled by just watching what she does every day. So again, please give another round of applause for Dr. Jinda.
I'm a walker too, so I'm gonna take the microphone too. Thank you very much for that effusive introduction. And I'm gonna do one other unscripted thing, which is if you want to get involved with HIV, we do have a group in San Antonio called the End Stigma End HIV Alliance that has a large number of just regular community members, mostly living with or affected by HIV. Our next meeting is going to be, I think, the 19th of November, and it's open to everybody. And if you're interested in joining, the November meeting is sort of a reboot after we lost momentum during COVID. So it's a good time to come and make a difference in the direction of that group. Okay, but we're actually here to talk about COVID. And I'm also really eager to hear Professor Salas, so I'm going to be probably even briefer than Zeta. So I'm going to start with just some basics about where we are COVID-wise right now, which is when you look at our community-wide status bar, we're in the mild range because most indicators are going down except for the hospital trends and hospital stress, which are still moderate or yellow. And you can see that in the inset on the right-hand side, whether you're looking at people hospitalized in the top line, or the ICU in the middle line, or on ventilators in the bottom line. We're, it's better than September over here, but it's not great. And I will say that we are currently still at a higher level than we were before the winter surge last year, which began November the 1st of 2020. Now, on the other hand, we weren't vaccinated last year. On the third hand, maybe some of those vaccines are starting to wear off, so we're still walking into the unknown together. For those of you keeping track of such things, the weekly moving average is 11.9 cases per 100,000 this week. Positivity rate is 1.9%, so those are both lower than last week. moving to, what'd I do? Okay, there we go. Moving to vaccination status. So these numbers that are on our dashboard at covid19.sanantonio.gov, there are a lot of ways to slice and dice how we think about vaccination, but the important one to me is the percent of the total population, not just people who are eligible, who are fully vaccinated, because one vaccine is not going to do too much for you. So that's 63.6%. That is still not high enough. You might remember that before Delta, people were talking about wanting to get to at least 70 for herd immunity, for that community immunity. That's before Delta. So if COVID is like a fire, there's still a lot of dry wood lying around out there that could burn up. The green picture shows that the older you get, the more likely you are to be fully vaccinated. Well, it's not cause and effect. Well, it is kind of cause and effect, but all right, so that's age. Then we're going to look at race and ethnicity. This one's a little more complicated. I'll slow down. The green bar on the left is the percent of people, not percent, it's the number of people fully vaccinated. The middle bar in orange, I don't care, that's the partly vaccinated. The blue is the total number of people in that group. And then along the bottom, we've got Hispanic, white, black, Asian, and other. So the black line, and I did struggle a little with PowerPoint, so the black line's not exactly where I want it to be all the time, but the black line is to show you where the green is relative to the blue. So for instance, when you look at Hispanic people, it's about halfway up there, right? White folks, more than halfway. Black folks, about halfway. Asian people, more than halfway. Other, what happened here? Because suddenly the percent vaccinated is higher than the percent of everybody in the group. That's because people get confused about, like Hispanic people feel like, I'm not white or black or Asian, I don't know which box to check when you're giving me this form. What about if I'm biracial or multiracial? I don't feel like I belong in it. So the kind of good news out of this slide is that probably there are more people vaccinated in the non-white categories than we might think. So that's race and ethnicity, but we still got a ways to go. And then we're going to look at geography. The map on the left, I would be surprised if Professor Salas does not talk about it. Yes, the real quick version, this is a map from 1933 of redlining, but the short version is what's red and kind of yellowish there. Those are the areas that were systematically, structurally deprived. And on the right, in the current map, you can see that we're still living with the repercussions of that, right? So this is the COVID index that we use as a tool at Metro Health. When there weren't many vaccines, everybody wanted vaccines, everybody wanted them at their events. What did we do? This is an overlay of the equity index from the city of San Antonio's equity office. So it's like looking at all kinds of injustices, all social and economic all together, overlaid with COVID cases and COVID deaths. By the way, before I move on to show you how we use the map, there you can kind of see some red pins there. Those were the mass vaccination sites back in February-ish, and 2 of those were not a given, because back then, take you way back to remember that only hospitals were getting deliveries of vaccine at the time. So for these, there would have been nothing on the south side or that one on the far west side if we had not worked intentionally. And the community, the community, especially the south side community, agitated, and it can make a difference. So we used our map to figure out where to go for the pop-up vaccination events. I remember being at the very first one, February 28th. And the red pins are the Metro Health dots, or the Metro Health pop-ups. There are other community partners who are also doing pop-ups. So we did our part to try to fight the injustice. And hopefully that played a role in the way these 2 maps changed. So you can see April is when we made our first zip code map of where people are most and least vaccinated. The darker the red, the more vaccinations. So we got from there in April to there in October. So again, we got some work to do, but hey, we did all right, y'all, so far. And also there are different scales for these two maps. So on the left-hand side in April, to get to dark red, you had to be like 32% of your population was vaccinated. Here in October, to get to dark red, that's 80%. Quickly, vaccination status and whether you're more likely to be infected by or die of COVID. Basically, most people who are infected are unvaccinated, 95.9%. Most people who die are unvaccinated, 97.7% here in Bexar County. And we've got the same information, but with a timeline instead from March through September. The top line, people who are unvaccinated and infected. The bottom line is people who are vaccinated and infected. And then moving to national data for a while, I got a few slides of did you know. You may have heard that that men are more likely to die of COVID, which is true. But also what happens when we separate, when we disaggregate that data and also look at it by race. So the males are the lighter gray, and then females are the darker gray. So in every case, yes, men are more likely to die of COVID. But then when you look at black women, and there was a study that looked at both Georgia and Michigan, the red line is me helping to point out that black women have a higher death rate than Asian men or white men. Now let's look at, I wish I'd made this bigger. This is looking at age groups and comorbid conditions. So age groups, on the top you can see as your age bracket increases, you are more likely to die of COVID. On the bottom there are some diseases or chronic conditions that Zeta talked about, especially obesity and diabetes, where if you have those and you have COVID, you are more likely to die of COVID. But you can see that the far, far bigger factor is age. The other thing I want to point out is that this big increase starts at age 40. So we're not just talking about people who are 80 years old here. And so with the last slide, for anyone who thinks, I'm too young, I don't care about COVID, I want to show you that COVID was the #1 leading cause of death nationally for people 35 to 54 last month in September. So this is January through September, and you can see the darker purple is where COVID was a higher cause of death. So COVID was the #1 cause of death, beating out accidents in people ages 35 to 45 or 44. And above cancer for people ages 45 to 54. Whereas, you go to January and it's mostly just age, people 45 and up. COVID was the leading cause of death in January for those ages. Finally, yesterday, the FDA, or a panel at the FDA, recommended approving, or authorizing, the COVID vaccine in children ages 5 to 11. And they showed almost 91% effectiveness in about 2,200 young people. That is based on at least 8 weeks of safety data in 1,400 of those young people. Why is 8 weeks a cutoff? Because we see vaccine adverse events by 6 weeks. So we can feel good about those 1,400. I sure wish the number was bigger than 1,400, but rare adverse events will not be seen until larger numbers of children are vaccinated. But we know on a small scale seems safe. So the next steps are still, it has to go to the full FDA, it has to go to the CDC panel, and then the CDC before it comes out. And that's it. And I'm not really taking questions, I want to move on. So was born in San Antonio, Texas. It's got your whole birthday here. Is that safe? Salas became an advocate for San Antonio's African American community in the early 70s, was a key member of local activist groups like the San Antonio chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Organizations United for Eastside Development, the Black Coalition on Mass Media, and Frontline 2000. He was on the city council and served 2 terms as representative for District 2. He's a lecturer, he's a retired assistant professor of political science. This does not say half the things that you've done.
That's enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, when I was asked to do this assignment, I looked at it from several points of view, and I did figure on the health department would do an excellent job with the statistical outlay, and she did. So that I don't have to worry about. So I can concentrate on the narrative, and the narrative is quite interesting indeed. And for the gentleman who was up here from Chicago, I think, or Cincinnati, or somewhere, I'd like to do the historical part, and I like to do the parts that most people don't know anything about. And some of you, because it looks like I'm speaking to the choir for the most part in here, you'll know about some of the stuff that I'll talk about already, like Tuskegee Experiment, Henrietta Lacks, those kinds of things. I'll talk about that, but also talk a little bit about some of the history. And for the gentleman there, I always like to tell people from out of town that, the San Antonio River is beautiful. And the way they've got it fixed up is beautiful. But most people don't know that the river itself was the first line of segregation. When the Moors moved, when Christianized Moors and Canary Islanders came to San Antonio around 1718, what they did was they sent darker skinned people, mainly Christianized Moors, to the eastern side of the river. That's how the east side became the historic black community. It was done under the Spanish system of segregation. And of course that was set up during the Inquisition, where you would be literally vetted by people, visual vetting. You know, like your hair is a little bit too curly. Oh my God, you're polluted with the blood of Africans. And this is the method that they would use. So I'd like to talk about a little bit about that. And then from a scientific point of view, I do like to talk about the creation of races. Scientifically, there's only one race. It's human. And that's real easy to understand because race implies species, right? We all belong to the same species. And last time I checked, I don't think alligators and hippos can get it on and produce an offspring. But an Asian man can marry a black woman and produce an offspring. So there you have clear evidence that we only have one species of human being, right? Homo sapiens. So getting to the health part, we have to go back, way back. And I'm not going to go back as far as the Spanish 1400s and Portuguese who began to identify darker skin with racial identification. And certainly it was there. I want to move a little bit further into the 1800s where scientific racism was developed. Who invented, and sometimes when I teach my class, you get people dropping their jaws. I say, what were you before you were white? And people drop their mouths. I don't know. I said, well, you were, ethnically speaking, you were Irish or German or French or Italian or whatever the case may be, and you were collapsed into a box called whiteness. Later on, of course, or during that same time frame, whiteness began to be identified with the term Caucasian, another invented term. And ironically, really ironic too, Caucasians are just, if you're referring to Caucasians from the Caucasus Mountains of Russia, you're referring to people who have a little bit, tiny bit darker skin, unlike ethnic Russians. So that is a misnomer in and of itself. So, but you have to, when you have a society based on white supremacy, you've got to get rid of all the other arguments. And those arguments would have included religious arguments. And by the way, if people don't never normally think about this, those 13 colonies were as full of religious hatred as existed in Europe before they came here. So if you were Catholic and got off the wrong boat, or got on the wrong boat and landed in a Protestant colony, you better convert real quick or you might be pillarized. And you know what that is. Put your head in a block, your hand sticking out, and people walk by and spit on you and beat you up and what have you. Or burned at the stake like Mary Dyer's a Quaker. I believe she was burned in a Catholic, or maybe probably a Protestant colony. More likely a Puritan colony. So religious hatred was already there. But so how do you collapse that hatred to make Western Europeans one united group? Well, you make them all white. So Germans become white. There's a great book called How the Irish Became White. If you haven't read it, you should. How Germans became white, right? How Frenchmen became white. They were all collapsed into whiteness. So in 1789, roughly, when they get the Constitution worked out, they come up with the First Amendment, which says what? Freedom of religion. So now you removed religious hatred, and you're going to replace it with racial hatred. So this is an interesting point. And during the 1700s, you had scientific racists. Johann Blumenbach, you can Google him if you got a phone. Carolus Linnaeus created, I believe, the term Caucasian. Blumenbach did Caucasian. And there was many, many others who invented races, and they attached temperaments to the races. Temperaments meaning if you were identified as Caucasian, then you became quick-witted, inventive, creative. But if you were identified as, say, Ethiopian, which was another racial category they invented, then you were lazy, you were all these other negative things. So they attached these temperaments to racial categories that in science actually don't exist. So there is the creation or the road from which we moved forward. And in moving forward, they come up with all kinds of things because of the slave trade. They actually had a mania, I guess I'll call it, called drapetomania. And drapetomania meant that you had some sort of problem, mental problem. It was a mania that affected slaves, and guess what? It manifested itself in the uncontrollable impulse to wander off and run away. As if being a slave wasn't enough to make you do that. So they identified that in different medical circles as the reason why slaves would run away. They characterized it as a medical problem. So this so-called disorder was actually identified in a medical report that was often cited as a cause of slaves running away. So I like to go back to that. Segue forward, and these were all done by Enlightenment thinkers. You know, when you go to a university, you're taught about the great works of Voltaire and Kant and all those folks, but you're not told about their shortcomings, which were in some cases horrible. Kant, probably one of the biggest racists around. Voltaire, same thing. You can go through each one of them, and some of them are people that you would respect ordinarily because you never heard the other side of that story. That includes, as some of you well know, James Marion Sims, who was a plantation doctor who experimented on women who had problems with separation, skin separations between the release of the bladder and the uterus. And so he attempted to do these operations on slave women. Now I've seen some reports in Gester and other scientific journals that suggest, well, these women volunteered to do it. There was no consent form to do that. And by the way, have anybody ever heard of a slave being able to refuse whatever they've been asked to do? You can't refuse. So he had these subjects, black women slaves, that he operated on when there was anesthesia no anesthesia for them. And so there would be other doctors training for this, standing around watching these poor women scream to no end. Horrible. That's what he did. And there's statues of this guy all over the country. I believe they removed some. One of them got graffiti quite bad, and I couldn't help but laugh. But anyway, and they did remove it because of the history of this guy. But the excuses that are brought up for him is things like this. Well, he was just a man of his times. Now, really? Well, there was hundreds of thousands of people that opposed slavery, that opposed those kinds of things. They're not talked about. They're erased from the history books. San Antonio, there was an anti-slavery man named Benjamin Lundy who believed that the Battle of the Alamo was a slave owner rebellion. It wasn't freedom fighters. They were slave owners. This was a white abolitionist who didn't agree. And there were many, many other people who didn't agree, but they got wiped from the history books so that you only get one version of that particular story. So you've got American medical crimes being committed. We're not talking about crimes that happened in Nazi Germany. We're talking about crimes that happened in the United States or in America. So these experimentations take place in this country in a number of different ways. And look, somebody asked me, you're going to have a hard task tonight. And I go, why? Because you're going to talk about all these things, and then you're going to tell people to go take the COVID vaccinations. I said, yeah, I know it. But the big difference is, in my mind, the main difference is, we have institutional review boards. Like when professors write papers, like I do, or someone else brings me a paper and says, will you peer preview this, right? We've got these medical institutional review boards that look at the data before they ever sign off, and those boards are created as a result of those horrible experiments. So we've got some safeguards in place that the general public doesn't know about. I mean, you ask the average person, do you know about the Medical Institutional Review Board? What's that? They don't know nothing about it. And so there has to be a lot of education that takes place to bring this stuff to people's attention. So that's pretty important. I usually start off speaking when the matter comes up about taking the flu. By the way, I've had both Pfizers and the boosters, so I've got all three. And I got shut up with the flu shot last week. And all the other, all those other shots too. And I lost count years ago. I finally got a pneumonia shot, and then they tell me you ain't got to take it again because you're too old now. You don't need it now. So, and I'm one of those kind of guys that, and the public needs to get this way too. I've known any number of women throughout the years who had fibroid tumors, and instead of looking at that really closely, there have been some unethical practices where they're told, you need to get a hysterectomy like right now, when in fact that didn't pan out to be the absolute best diagnosis or treatment. So that kind of stuff is going on as well. So I always like to start off by just telling people as far as the vaccine goes, I actually saw this on Facebook one day. Somebody came up with a rhyme, and sometimes rhymes really work. So I love the one they came up with, mask it or casket. Mask it or casket. So I couldn't resist that, but well, the way I am, I like to invent my own. So I came up with, get the shot or buy a burial plot. So this dark history of medical practices and experimentation by physicians and medical staff, which was aimed mainly against African Americans at some point, well, against Native Americans too, but a lot of it because of Jim Crow during slavery, then Jim Crow, and then beyond. Because we know the Tuskegee Experiment, where they shot death into your body, lasted for 40 years, all the way from 1932 all the way up to 1972. So we're talking about things that have taken place for a really long period of time. So this history of medical abuse is something that's known in the minds of black people. It's called collective memory. They may not be old enough to know. I'm looking at Carl Booker. He ain't old enough to know, to have been around when that was going on, probably. But he heard about it enough from his parents, grandparents, from reading stuff. So this distrust is bound to be there because of the history of this stuff. So this is called collective caution. Collective caution. You're cautious about what you're going to do when you're going into the medical community because of this long history of abuse. It's not been nice. However, in the black community and Hispanic community as well, black doctors can make the difference. Black nurses can make the difference. Black medical personnel can make the difference. I was asked earlier today by the Expression News, what do you think besides education would help blacks to overcome this stuff? And I said, you know what? I've seen the COVID vaccine shot remote wagons on the curbs. We need to get some black doctors out there standing out in front of the wagon telling people in those communities they need to get the shot. There have been reports of black doctors trying to convince their mothers, who may be 80, 90 years old, to take the shot. They won't do it because this is what they remember of how it was. And then you've got this pyramid of racial fiction. Black people's skin is thicker than everybody else's. That's one, right? So thick skin produces this unequal treatment. And by the way, in case you didn't know it, I could go pinch somebody white and they'll scream like hell, and I pinch a black person, doesn't bother them at all. Because according to this mythology, black people can take pain greater than, say, white people. Well, you know, a football player can take greater pain than me. And I don't care what color he is. So that doesn't make any sense for someone to still think that. And we know from the historical records and from even now that there's still people saying those kinds of things. People coming out of medical school. We know from press reports that there have been reported incidents of immigration officers ordering unnecessary hysterectomies on people that are migrants in detention camps. We know that there have been forced sterilizations across the country, some 65,000 forced sterilizations over a certain period of years. And we know about the famous case of Fannie Lou Hamer, very famous civil rights worker, and she was sterilized unbeknownst to her. And she called it a Mississippi appendectomy. That's what they did in Mississippi to black women on a regular basis. There have been some lawsuits filed over the course of time, one of them against, I think, North Carolina, where they won a $10 million lawsuit that was eventually paid out. So these human subjects abused, and in this discussion about any of this subsequent research, one should examine the work of Dana Raina Berry, professor at UT Austin, who wrote a book called, you haven't got it yet, you need to read it, The Price for the Pound of Flesh. It's a great book. When children were taken from their mothers on a slave auction block, the children would be sold by the pound, like a hog, a pig, or something like that. And there were 4 things that happened to blacks' bodies when they died. The 4 that I generally speak about. If you're black and you died on a plantation, if the slave master was nice, whatever that means, he would allow that black person to be buried in a segregated cemetery on the plantation. If he wasn't so nice and he owned hogs, that body would be chopped up and fed to hogs. Very common in the southern states. The 3rd thing they would do, in a lot of plantations, because they needed water to irrigate the crops, they would just drag that black body down to the river and let the alligators take it off. And last but not least, where this involves the medical community, they would go to a funeral. Sometimes they would hire a black janitor or staff worker at Johns Hopkins University, the medical school. They would hire them to go to a funeral, pretend to cry, it was a great funeral, get the shovel and dig him up as soon as everybody leaves. Then they would go sell the body to a medical school for dissection, where white doctors would learn how to dissect the body. They did this at Johns Hopkins, University of Pennsylvania, University of Virginia. I mean, I could go on and on and on. One of them, pay the ultimate price, because when General Sherman led his troops across Georgia and cut the Confederacy in half, there were slaves who came out and said, they're cutting people up there on that hospital, they're digging black bodies out of the ground. And General Sherman, being the man that he was, he believed in total war. He sent the soldiers up there, and in one case, he sent black soldiers up there and literally told them, burn that hospital to the ground. And they actually did that, and I believe it was in Virginia where that one took place. So these are humans. I mean, when humans are designated as property and they're not human, this is what happens when you have a system where people are designated as property. So, and even others, when Nat Turner, who was a hero, he led a slave insurrection in 1831. When he was killed, he lost, but when he was killed, they cut his body up, they sold his skull to different people, and that skull was passed on from one doctor to another, to where it was finally recovered in the 20th century. It was in a doctor's office, attic somewhere. And that skull was finally returned to the ancestors of Nat Turner because his skeleton had been passed on from person to person to person. They also, by the way, routinely would have someone, sometimes, who knew how to cut up bodies, to go and take someone who had been hanged and cut different parts of their body off, or sometimes just a mob would do it. And they would take a thumb, cut it off, put it in their pocket and save it for a souvenir, or sell it at a local barber shop. The skull and the body remains of Nat Turner, his skin was stripped off. One guy actually made a wallet out of his skin. This is the kind of things that went on, and during hangings, sometimes doctors would come along to the hangings to make sure the person was dead and kind of go along with the ride. So you see this situation, and Harriet Washington, who wrote a great book, if you haven't read that, you need to get it, called Medical Apartheid, which is another great book. So body snatching, it didn't originate in this country, they were doing it in England all the time. If you go to UT Health Science Center in the library there, they have a rare book, and it's called, I forget the exact name, but it's called The Resurrection Men. People who stole bodies out of the cemetery were called resurrection men. They lift the body up, resurrect it from the dead, and then sell it to a medical school for dissection. So skeletons travel. In Dr. Berry's research, she talked about black adult bodies were sold at medical schools for $12. Infants were sold from birth to 8 years old for $4. Mothers and infant corpses were sold for $15 in the late 1700s, 1800s, and so forth. I already pretty much did James, Marion, and Sims. It was probably the worst of the bunch in olden days. He experimented on 3 women, Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy. Lucy was only 18 years old, who had given birth a few months prior and was unable to control her bladder, and during the medical procedure, she was completely naked, where doctors were standing around gaping at her and so forth. They say that she endured long, long hours of surgery with no anesthesia, screaming in agony. And in Sims' own autobiography, he actually wrote, Lucy's agony was extreme. She eventually became extremely ill due to his controversial use of a sponge to drain the urine away from the bladder, which led her to get blood poisoning later on. And he said, quote, I thought she was going to die. It took 2 or 3 months to recover entirely from the effects of his operation. So, Sims, and look, he was inculcated with this white supremacist belief. He literally believed that blacks were less intelligent than whites. He believed that, and he borrowed these ideas from the Enlightenment, from the scientific racism of the Enlightenment thinkers. This is where he got these ideas from. And he claimed the reason why blacks were less intelligent than whites, because it was a result of their skulls growing too quickly around their brain. I mean, you know, look, I experiment on myself every now and then. Please don't worry about me, doctor. I'll be all right. But I know my body. Yeah, I dropped a big book on my foot one day, And you know what happens when you drop a book on your toenail? It turns real dark underneath because it bled and now the blood dried. Now I went to the foot doctor, and look, I'm not accusing her or anything, but I'm just saying, I went to the foot doctor and I said, you know, that looks pretty ugly. I don't want to keep walking around with a toe that looks like it's still bleeding and it's not. It's ugly. She said, well, go away. So, you know, I guess what I did? I went and got a water pick that I use on my teeth. I got rid of that dark spot real quick. I'm not advising you to do it. I did put a salt solution in it, so it was the kind of salt solution you use when you irrigate your nose. So it was okay. But blaming the victims is what Sims did. Doctors during that time didn't like dealing with women at all. As a matter of fact, a lot of them even refused to look at a woman that was not clothed. Okay? So he became kind of like the pioneer of women's health, unfortunately. And that's why they put up all those statues all over the place about him. So keep in mind all this history, Henrietta Lacks, right? And everybody in here is black in one sense. If you had a polio vaccine, you got Henrietta Lacks' DNA in your body because that's how they invented polio, from her cells. For whatever reasons, her cells wouldn't die, according to some of the material out there, and they found a way to make a vaccine using her blood cells, which they stole from her. She died. Her relatives were never given compensation for what they did. She was a poor black woman, and they stole her blood cells, which are now in probably everybody in this room's body from the polio vaccine. So her cells are in all of us to some degree. But the unethical use of human subjects was the reality which was hidden and erased until investigators discovered the truth, and very much akin to Nazi-like behavior in the experimentation on Jewish people during the Holocaust. As a matter of fact, if you read Hitler's autobiography, he even claimed that he got much of his ideas about treating people badly from America. This is where he got his ideas from. So he learned how to be a bad boy. When we look at, in the local level, when we look at doctors, if you were black and born in San Antonio, there was no real hospital for you. You had to go to a hospital called the Good Samaritan Hospital, which is now part of St. Philip's College. Former City Councilman John Sanders was born there. So you still have people that were born in a segregated hospital in San Antonio. So don't believe folks when they say, oh, it's just a great city here, nothing ever bad happened here. Well, come on, man. Some of the stuff that happened here is just as bad as happened in Mississippi. The Robert B. Greene Hospital had a colored clinic in the back, right? And so did most of the other clinics. Because what racist white people, and I don't like to just say white people, because they are anti-racist white people, but whites who were racist, they did not want to see blacks in the hospital. As a matter of fact, they didn't even want to see a black person walk by their house. So they would complain, if you're going to service blacks, why don't you put that thing in the back somewhere? And that's kind of what they did at Robert B. Greene and other hospitals as well. I believe Santa Rosa had one of those as well, too. So they used racism. They had these segregated hospitals. And by the way, if you were black in some other places, I haven't documented any here yet, but if you were black and you went to a white hospital and it was serious, you might die in the parking lot because they were not going to service you. You had to call a black ambulance, you had to call someone to come pick you up to take you to a black clinic. You might die in the parking lot. So this is pretty much what happened. Segregated clinics, segregated hospitals, medical books used during the segregation when they had literacy tests. They would say, you come here to vote, you're black. You come here to vote? Yeah. Well, you got to pay a poll tax. And maybe the guy says, oh yeah, I got $1 here, right here. Well, the next thing you got to do is read. Okay, I can read, give me the book. they would give them a medical book to read from. Hell, I can't read the name of my medicine on the bottle. Zantac, spelled with an X or Z. Anyway, I can't read my own medicine. So, and they would give whites a Jack and Jill book, elementary school book. Here's what you got to read. They give blacks the medical books, which we'll talk about, you know, subcutaneous tissue or whatever. Yeah, what the hell is that? So, as you can see, medical abuse is a big problem. So, finally in 1972, the Tuskegee Experiment, so-called experiment, they were busted because of an article in the newspaper. It was leaked by a journalist. And finally, they actually sent a letter from the public health system, the United States public health system, actually sent a letter to Tuskegee saying, you know, I think you guys better stop this. But it wasn't going to stop if that hadn't happened and it hadn't been exposed. It would have kept on going. And let me say this, there's still stuff going on. And this just took place. In the National Football League, they had a procedure that they would use to pay black players less money, called race norming, where they would say that blacks' cognitive levels are different from whites, so we have to kind of like lower that, which means they got lower pensions as well. That's called race norming. That's been done in 2021, and they finally, some black players did file lawsuits, and now that supposedly had stopped. So then they were wondering why their check was smaller than the white guy who had a concussion too. So this kind of stuff is still going on, so it's not just old stuff, it's new stuff as well. So race norming or race correction is an adjustment and broadly based medicine used that way. And statistical practice has been used in medical specialties like pulmonology, neuropsychology, et cetera, where there's still some racial practices going on as well. I don't have to tell you about, and I believe the doctor mentioned that if you live in certain zip codes, your life expectancy could be as low as 20 years less than the next person that lives on the north, to the north of 410. Probably now 1604, because the center of the city has changed. It used to be center of the city was like downtown. Center of the city is now on the other side of Loop 410. So if you live out that way, you probably are going to live 20 years longer than if you live south of, let's say, Hildebrand, south of Hildebrand. So we've got that still going on, and that, of course, was revealed in the health disparity study that took place some years back by the county. I think by the county did that. So look, I don't want to keep you any longer, but there's just so much more work we have to do in terms of educating people, in terms of letting them know we have these safeguards that weren't there for Tuskegee. Keep in mind, Tuskegee was a select group of people, you know, that they cornered and did that to, right? And I'll tell you, one of the best weapons to convince African Americans to take the shot is to just show them the film footage of when they released the vials in some other state. And they released those vials a little earlier or a little later, but they ran out of certain COVID vaccination bottles, and a bunch of them went into a black Walgreens. You should have seen the white people standing out there in a black Walgreens store to get the shot. And when a lot of black people saw that, you know what they said? Well, they ain't going to give it to themselves. Where do I sign up at? So be mindful that there's a general distrust amongst black people of the medical profession and of other things too. It's not just that, political as well. And I don't want to make it political by telling you about what the governor's doing. But it comes down to that as well. So, but do all you can to get black doctors, black nurses more involved. This group, I'm so happy you all are doing what you're doing. It's absolutely needed. And we got a long way to go, but we can get there if we get them to understand. Find that film where all the whites are standing outside, that's some convincing evidence. Because as an old man told me, hell, they're not going to poison themselves. So, good point. Having said that, I'm done.